Hello again, this is Doc Rotten from Horror News Radio and Gruesome Magazine. Joining me tonight is the one and only Thomas Mariani. He is here to talk about Blade Runner 2049, and you can guarantee he has some opinions about this film. Thomas, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Doc. It's weird. This is the first one of these we've officially released on the site with me on it. There have been audio issues with other ones we've tried to do with me. But I'm glad it's this movie that we're doing it for.
Well, we've been talking about Blade Runner 2049 for some time because one time we were going to do on the podcast, Horror News Radio. Other times we weren't. We were going to do a special thing and life got in the way. But here it is. It's out. But you'd always intended to talk about the original first. Is there something about the original Blade Runner you wanted to say?
Well, it's interesting because a lot of people have been comparing Blade Runner 2049 to sort of like a Mad Max Fury Road in terms of how it complements the original movie, and this is more of a direct sequel, I would say, because the genius of like a Fury Road is that it's a sequel, but it still kind of feels like it could just be its own thing and doesn't really follow continuity. Continuity is pretty crucial to like the main through line of this movie, but I'll get into why it's maybe not at the same time. It'll be interesting. But the first Blade Runner is a highly influential movie. Obviously. And to be fair, the reason we were going to try and do something special, Doc, is because until fairly recently you hadn't seen the original, right?
I had not, and I did catch it in preparation for Blade Runner 2049. Unfortunately, I did not get to see it in the theaters yet. But I caught the final cut version of it and was impressed with the visuals and most of the story. But tell us what you have to say about it.
I mean, I have similar issues with the original Blade Runner in terms of, I think it's interesting because the original was done at a time when there was a big strike in Hollywood, especially amongst like directors and writers. But Ridley Scott, who directed the original, didn't want to like stop production. So he's like, you know what, art department, take a full year to just develop this world. And you can tell. The world of Blade Runner is incredible. Every single nook and cranny has such great detail that shows off this world that might be a bit dated considering places like, Atari aren't, isn't a brand anymore really, or Pan Am or other places that are like show up there and do show up in the sequel and present itself as like an alternate reality where these companies still flourish in as much as you can flourish in the dystopia of the new one. But there's also such great ideas with, I think, the Rachel character. And also, especially, no matter what I say about Blade Runner 2049, the best part of either movie is still Rutger Hauer as Roy Batty, the sort of evil replicant who ends up delivering the best monologue in cinematic history with the Tears and Rain. You can agree with that.
Yeah, I would say that Roy Batty, I was more interested in his character than I was in Harrison Ford's character.
I generally agree with that, especially like that Tears and Rain speech is perfect, and he improvised a lot of that, which is interesting. It's an amazing performance. It's such a great portrayal of that character. And it's really interesting because in this movie, in the new Blade Runner 2049, we follow someone who, unlike Harrison Ford, where the big debate in that first movie was, is he a replicant or not? We follow someone who we know from the start is a replicant with Ryan Gosling, who plays a Blade Runner. In the opening scene, he is following Dave Bautista, who plays a rogue Blade Runner, who plays a rogue replicant that's been staying off in this farm, trying to be cool, not bother anybody. But, Ryan Gosling's job is to hunt him down. And Dave Bautista says right at like the tail end of like their big fight scene, like, how does it feel to kill your own kind? Confirming completely Ryan Gosling is a replicant, which feeds into his big story. Because after he gets rid of Bautista in that opening scene, he goes over to his chief, played by Robin Wright, who says, well, we found some remains on that location based on something that you scanned, and we found the bones of a replicant. But as they're scanning those bones, they notice something, that this replicant had scar tissue that it would indicate that it had evidently birthed a child, which has never happened in the history of replicants being around. There's never been procreation between these replicants. And Robin Wright is trying to shut it all down, but Gosling gets curious about it, wants to find out more. And as he finds out more, he starts seeing some interesting connections that might pull in a Mr. Deckard.
Yeah, it sounds like another Sorry. But people go to these for the visuals, and we have a new director. Ridley Scott is not directing the sequel. It's Denis Villeneuve. Is that pronounced right? Or close?
Closer than you've gotten before, Doc. That's much better than usual. But yes, this is Denis Villeneuve, who has recently done stuff like Arrival last year, which got a lot of Oscar buzz, Sicario, and Prisoners, and some other French films beforehand. But he's a perfect person to take on that mantle, because he's somebody who I think better than Ridley Scott can bounce enormous, ponderous, gorgeous visuals with actual like character and emotion in it, which I think has been a problem with me and Ridley Scott, especially as of recent. But I think Villeneuve does a great job of, I think, taking a lot of the ideas that are represented in Blade Runner and I think improving upon them. I would honestly say I prefer 2049 to the original Blade Runner, because I think it presents a lot, especially with Ryan Gosling's replicant character, that puts him center stage, but at the same time does a great job of making him have different perspectives on what his role is in society. It's hard to say this without spoiling it, but he changes his perspective on what his role is in this larger world, because he's presented as initially just a replicant who's very much, filling a job, very much sort of like a noir cop character. That's a big part of Blade Runner, is that sort of sci-fi noir style. And he is somebody who lives an existence where he's in this very cramped area. The world of Blade Runner has definitely aged 30 years since the original took place in 2019. Here, the society that they live in is very clearly much more compact and cramped together. And there's so little, space for these people to breathe. Like, literally his apartment complex is essentially a small cube that he lives in. And he has a sort of fake domesticated life, but it's with this android named Joy, who is like a hologram, sort of like an Apple tech, as it were, that like it's a hologram that he, has a lot of feelings for as, another artificial being, but they can never really touch. He can start moving around because he gets this like little clip that allows her hologram to move outside. And there's a beautiful, gorgeous sequence where he tries to kiss her out in the rain. It's for the first time she's been able to go outside onto the balcony of this apartment complex. And it's this moment where they come together. And then a message from Robin Wright shows up and she says, "You need to come back. We found more evidence. You need to come back over here." And it just crushes everything. They were about to like have this passionate embrace that even for a hologram and a replicant who has like an actual corporeal being, it's this beautiful, touching scene that represents so much of what Ryan Gosling's struggling for. And it's honestly like Ryan Gosling has gotten a lot of praise in recent years, but at the same time, I've heard some criticism that like, oh, he's always so aloof and distant. Perfect for a replicant, though. It's like he's honestly so perfect to play a part like that. And you can see that roboticness, but you can also see that desire for humanity, that want to have something more than you do as a replicant, as a second-class citizen. And I think they represent that so perfectly, where he's just expected to do his job, but he wants a bit more than that, strives for more. And you really want to follow him, especially as his role changes in context as the story goes along.
Well, one of the stars of the film has gotten a lot of grief in the past few years for a role in a certain Warner Brothers DC film. Jared Leto. How is he in this as Neander Wallace?
It's interesting because the Wallace character is basically like the Tyrell of this new world, right? Where Tyrell was the guy who created these replicants. He was played by Joe Turkel in the original, who you might recognize as the bartender from The Shining. Mm-hmm. Here, he's a bit more distant and aloof a character than even Joe Turkel was, which is saying something. But it's weird because it's perfect casting for Jared Leto in that he plays a pretentious asshole who doesn't care about other people. So spot on casting. But I do think his character is one of the few flaws I really have with the movie, in that he doesn't have the most interesting motivation. Beyond sort of like, oh, someone's figured out something that I haven't about the whole like replicants being able to reproduce, and he wants to find out more about that. And as the story goes along, he feels a lot more distant, but yet at the same time, his scenes are kind of crucial to the other characters. It's a weird, like, necessary evil for the movie, but at the same time, he's one of the least interesting people in the movie. I think there are other people around him that are a lot more interesting, like particularly Sylvia Hoeks plays Love, who is his sort of like main replicant sort of henchman, and she's terrifying and just like essentially like the best version of a female Terminator that T3 could never give us. Pretty much, she feels like the best version of that character. Especially there is a point where she encounters a character, and I'll just say she does something with a glass that is brutal and disturbing, and this movie earns its R rating right there, and with a lot of other stuff. This is very much an adult science fiction movie, which is so rare to see, especially with a massive budget like it has. So it's like $150 million budget. It's a very risky move, and I appreciate it, especially since it is, like I said, ponderous science fiction, that they were able to get a movie like this on such a big scale.
Right, because the running time is 2 hours and 44 minutes. Rather lengthy.
Pretty long.
Yes.
Pretty long. maybe a bit. But I think it earns every minute, I think, because it really gets you inside that world, but also these characters a lot. And especially the journey that I think the Ryan Gosling K character goes on is one that I think is worth spending all this time in this environment. And then especially interesting once he meets up with Harrison Ford, who I will just say up front is not in a lot of the movie. He doesn't show up until around like I think an hour 50 into this 245-hour movie, so barely an hour in the movie. he has like screen time. But I think him and Gosling show a very interesting different perspectives on this world in a way that I won't go too far into it for spoilers, but Ryan Gosling has a lot more hope, whereas, shocker, Harrison Ford plays an old curmudgeonly guy who doesn't have as much hope about this world, given especially sort of the events that have happened in his life up to this point. But I think it's a subtle and understated performance that I say I would slightly prefer to Ford in Force Awakens, where he was fun, but I think kind of more going on what he did earlier as opposed to truly evolving like I think he does here. This is a much more embittered, like distant Deckard than he even was in the past, and I think they do a great job of evolving his character.
Interesting. Now, for the horror fans of the site, you mentioned that it earns its R rating. Plenty of stuff for the fans, or are they going to have to kind of put their sci-fi geek on to get through this?
I mean, it's definitely more sci-fi geek, but you do really see the sort of empty, ravaged wastelands here that I think evoke a lot of horror, but more on a, like I said, thinking man's level. There is gore, there is blood at points. Like I said, there's one moment involving a glass that's pretty brutal. There are a few other pretty gory moments, but this isn't very much an action film. The few action sequences that are there are impressive. Like there's a great one involving Ryan Gosling and Harrison Ford that takes place with a lot of like sort of broken down holograms that show up in this one environment. I won't go too far into it, but it's very haunting and very mysterious, and there's definitely sort of a ethereal, horrific emptiness that's going on around. And it feels almost kind of like a ghost movie, but really the ghosts are of our old society and of the old society even of the original Blade Runner. And I think they do a really great job of selling that on a horrific scale, but not necessarily in a horrific way that's traditional. But it's definitely still much more thinking man sci-fi overall.
One more question before we wrap this up, and that is there origami in this film?
Yes, there is. Edward James almost makes a brief appearance, and he does a bit of origami. And it's a delightful little moment that carries Ryan Gosling along early on in the movie. But not as much as there is in the original film. There's no moment where he says, but then, she won't live, but then again, who does? Which is also a great line in that original movie.
Go ahead and give us your score, 1 to 5, and your favorite scene.
I would give this a 4 out of 5. I was really impressed by it. And I would say my favorite scene is, like I said, won't spoil it, but it's the last shot of Ryan Gosling in this movie. I think it's a very beautiful, touching bit that recalls a certain incredible moment from the original Blade Runner, but twists the perspective beautifully and does it without a single line of dialogue. I really loved that shot.
Very interesting. All right. Well, Thomas, as always, thank you for your reviews. Let's say goodnight.
Good night, everybody.
Be sure to visit GruesomeMagazine.com to listen to the other Gruesome podcasts, Hard News Radio, and Decades of Horror. Also check out the Gruesome Magazine Quarterly, available in digital and print on demand format.